Hello, Piedmonsters, and welcome to Piedmonsters, the Piedmont Pilot Podcast, brought to you by your Piedmont MEC. I'm your host, Megan Johnson, Charlotte-based First Officer and Vice Chair of our Communications Committee. Did you miss us? Because we missed you. I'm sure you've all been waiting on the edge of your seats for a new podcast episode, so thank you for your patience as we took a little summer break. We're back and hopefully better than ever, but definitely at least as good as ever. We're returning with a back-to-school special, if you will, with part one of a two-part interview with Captain David Weidenhamer, chair of our training committee. In part one, we're discussing a general overview of the training committee, training review boards, and what to expect during CQ. Part two, coming soon, will cover upgrade as well as some other miscellaneous tips and tidbits. Before we move to that, as always, we have some updates from around the MEC. And as a side note, I am recording this from an overnight in Madison, Wisconsin, so please bear with us with any audio abnormalities you might hear. We're doing the best we can. The Piedmont MEC met this week up in Philadelphia. The primary focus of the meeting agenda was midterm bargaining, which is quickly approaching in January. Thank you to everyone who participated in the recent online survey. We had outstanding participation from our pilot group. The MEC looks forward to using the information gathered to best support our pilots when bargaining begins. In conjunction with the MEC meeting, the MEC also hosted a pub event this week at the Philadelphia Phillies game. Thank you to all who participated, and we hope that everyone was able to have a great evening at the ballpark with family, friends, and coworkers. More information on holiday events will be released soon, so be on the lookout. Congratulations to First Officer Julian Work, the new Secretary-Treasurer of LEC 29, representing Philadelphia and Harrisburg pilots. Please review communication from the MEC sent September 18th regarding the FAA Airman Registry System, data privacy, and a reminder about Piedmont's social media policy. Thank you, as always, for listening. Like and subscribe to Piedmonsters wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. And follow us on Instagram at Piedmont Pilots. You can also email us at pdtpodcast@alpa.org with any comments or suggestions. That's it for our updates and around the MEC this week. Now for our interview with David Weidenhamer of the Training Department. Hello, Piedmonsters, and welcome back. We are joined today by our training department representative for our MEC, David Weidenhamer. David, could you please say hello to the people and introduce yourself a little bit?
Good morning, everybody. My name's David Weidenhamer. I'm a June 2019 hire. I am currently a sim instructor at Piedmont, along with the Czech Airman. Right now, I am Philly-based, but I have gone back and forth between Philly and Charlotte because I am a commuter, so I pick whichever is the easiest for me to get to at the time.
Excellent. Thank you. And so just quickly, for those that don't know, we do within our MEC have a training committee that works directly between the training department and our pilots. Can you explain what the role is of the ALPA training committee? How do you guys interact with everybody?
Yeah, so the training department has its own management staff, very similar to the chief pilots, how they manage the pilots on the line. The nice thing about the training committee is that we have a very good working relationship between ALPA and the company. So if persons that are on the line are having some difficulties, they can give one of us a call in the training committee, and then we can try to work out what might be a good plan to see if we can't get you the help that you need. Now, with that being said, we also don't have the ability to pull people off of trips. We don't have the ability to pull people to training. Just like for hotels, I know everybody would like to think that ALPA has a whole lot of controls over hotels. At the end of the day, it's Piedmont's money, and it's Piedmont's decision on what ends up happening. But because of our relationship that we have with the company, it actually works out very well that we are receptive on both sides to things that are happening.
Again, just kind of like your local LEC reps, just another go-between between pilots and the company to help mediate situations that might not necessarily be ideal.
Yeah, and we're also here to help people that might have some questions about upcoming training. You know, every year everybody has to go to CQ. There's a CQ guide that in my comply for you to view. But if you have questions about like V1 cuts, you know, about RNAV approaches, what is the differences between the sims and the real aircraft? We might be able to answer some of those things for you. If you're a new hire in training, we can answer questions about, how could we better address a scenario that you might be in. And same thing if you're coming to upgrade training, what to expect and what to prepare for. So the nice thing about, like, with me being here, we have a couple check airmen on the committee, myself included. And then because I'm also a sim instructor, I'm actually involved in the full realm of training throughout Piedmont. So there's not much that doesn't happen that we can't speak to you on.
That's awesome, and a great resource for our pilots that I hope they are and continue to take advantage of. I know that one of the primary roles within the training committee is working with pilots in the company when it comes to what's called training review boards, or TRBs. Can you explain what a TRB is, how it works, and what that process looks like?
Yeah, so a training review board comes out of Section 11 of our collective bargaining agreement, and that is the training section. And what it ultimately is anybody can have a bad day when they come to training. So say you show up, something just doesn't feel right, and you had a bad CQ event. Okay, so now you have an ad, and you have to get signed back off to take whatever that CQ event is, whether it's your MB or LOE, and you just had a bad day. So we get together what is called a training review board. That consists of one person from training management, a chief pilot, an ALPA representative, and then somebody else from the training committee that represents the pilot. It is a non-disciplinary hearing, and it is there for the pilot to determine what they need in order to get backline qualified. So it's here to be helpful. But the biggest part of this is you have to do a self-determination on what you need. If you show up and you say, I don't know what I need, well, at this game with ATPs, we are all professional pilots, and we are expected to uphold ourselves as professional pilots, and self-determination is a huge part of that.
A little self-awareness is key of kind of where you're struggling and what you think would be best to help get things back on track.
And at the end of the day, we have to ask the honest question, do I want my family flying with this pilot? We've all flown with pilots on the line that we're a little sus about. Right? We sit there and we're like, we know that they are a pilot and they make it through training, but do I really want my family on the back of this aircraft? And that's when it's not a personal decision. It comes down to a business decision. Unfortunately, this last year we had two horrible incidents, one in the Potomac and one up in Canada. And the FAA comes in and says, let me see some training records. And that is risk no different than somebody who's sitting there trying to get car insurance, right? Eventually, your car insurance might drop you if you are deemed too high of a risk.
Yeah, and unfortunately, despite whatever the reasoning might be, the pilot qualifications are always going to come into question in those situations, whether that's valid criticism or not. And obviously, that's what is investigated. But we as pilots and the company at Piedmont have to be able to defend the decisions to the best of their ability. And I will say, as a full-time line pilot, I have been very fortunate in my time at Piedmont that I have not yet had a captain genuinely scare me or do anything that made me think that they didn't belong there. So the training department is definitely doing an effective job. So I do thank you for that.
Well, and that's good. And the things that keep us from answering the why question, right? If something comes up and you ever find yourself in front of the FAA, they're always going to ask, why did you do this? And if your answer is because Piedmont's AOM, Volume 1 or Volume 2, Piedmont's FOM says this is what is expected of us as a pilot, it changes the focus off of the individual now. But if you're like, well, because this is technique and, this is just how we do it, that's where, as a pilot, you are assuming risk on your own. And if something was to ever happen, you're going to have to answer to that risk.
Definitely. And that's why standardized training is so important, which I have heard, again, kind of bring it back to the TRBs. A pilot can be moved into what was previously called a special track, where they return for CQ every 6 months instead of 12. But my understanding is that process is changing. Can you explain what that new process is going to look like?
Yeah, so this was covered in a town hall a couple months ago from one of the training committee management. And now it's going to be called an optional day of training, an OTD. Or optional training day. And instead of you coming back for a full 3-day CQ cycle, which included all the ground, a CQMB and a CQ LOE, you're just coming back for 1 day of focused training. So you're still going to get a 4-hour sim. And right now, the way it's laid out is the first half of the 4-hour sim is going to be like a little mini MV. And then the second half is going to be a mini LOE. It's just going to be one leg like the pilot flying version of an LOE. But those events are supposed to be focused based off of where you were struggling during your previous unsat event. There was rumor out there that they might open this up to other people who want to voluntarily come back to do this, but that's going to be based off of training department needs, and that part isn't being implemented just yet. But I do think that this is a pretty good move because instead of you coming back and sitting through a full 8 hours of ground where basically you're dropping whole lines of flying, you're just going to come back for 1 day. 1 day, 4-hour sim slot. That's still supposed to be trained to proficiency, and it's supposed to be a pretty relaxed environment. Unless there is a safety of flight issue, it should be a non-PREA event. But anytime you're flying with a check airman, anytime you're working with a sim instructor, if there's a safety of flight issue, then they can hold that safety of flight against you.
Which, again, as we discussed, is their job. I kind of love that. That sounds like a great option, and it sounds definitely more convenient for the pilots, but also the idea that it's specialized and geared towards what that pilot specifically needs, I think makes a lot more sense than going through a bunch of training things that they didn't struggle with, that they've already gotten right, just to have them prove again that they can do that. I kind of like the idea of it being focused on areas that need focus. And that brings us to, you mentioned earlier that you guys are great resources for pilots going through CQ or going through upgrade. I just went through CQ just over a month ago for the second time with Piedmont. Definitely less scary the second time. But is there anything that you're seeing in the training department as a trend for pilots going through CQ, things that they're struggling with, things that you would like to see changing, and what they can do to better prepare and be more successful?
Yeah, so to quote one of our previous chief pilots, the reason why it's called continuing qualification is because you're supposed to be working on your qualification all the time. So if you're a person who waits till the week before CQ to study, you're going to have a difficult time in CQ. Every quarter, we get these online classes that we're supposed to have done. Everybody just goes next slide, next slide, next slide, takes the test, next slide, next slide, next slide. Hey, I did all 4 of them in about 7 minutes. But those are there to really help you get ready for CQ. And something is only as good as the effort that you're willing to put into it. So when you come for CQ, you know you're going to take a systems exam on day 1. That's going to happen. And if you're not familiar with the systems and where to find information between the FOMs and AOMs, you're going to struggle with that. With CQ, the check rides, they both have orals associated with them. Yes, it is only a 1-hour briefing, but they do have some oral component that will be asked of you. And again, if you just waited till the week of CQ to start studying, you may struggle a little bit when you get into those orals or just have one of those bad days. So try to work on looking over your manuals, especially if you're on reserve sitting RAS. You know, if you're at night and you're having a hard time falling asleep, just pull open the FOM. 1 page later, you'll be getting the best sleep of your life.
Absolutely.
But
Just like a lullaby.
Yeah, but at least try to make some attempt to look over the 3 main Piedmont manuals. So then we can get into the sim for the CQ MV. The things that we see that people struggle with those, right? One of which is kind of an unacceptable means because you have the ability to do it every day, and that is an RNAV approach. It is human inherent nature that people avoid the things that make them uncomfortable. But 90% of Piedmont flying is done in VMC conditions, and any approach that has an ILS also has an RNAV overlay on it. And if you're not spending those VMC days figuring out the ins and out of different ways to intercept and grab RNAV approaches and shoot those down utilizing the flight guidance controller, you're not just doing yourself a disservice because the first time you're going to be doing it is going to be in crappy weather. And that's not how we're supposed to train. Even though we're not training in the jet, we are always training. We're always trying to make our proficiency better. And then the second maneuver that people tend to struggle with, which is, it's an understandable one because you don't do it outside of the sim, and that is V1 cuts. But the important part of V1 cuts is you have to know the profile. If you're struggling on the rote memorization of the profile, then the flying aspect is always going to be behind because you don't know what to expect next. Now in CQ, it is trained to proficiency, so you are allowed to do a certain number of repeats until you run out of time. But we can't fix memorization issues in the sim. That has to be done well in advance. And the only difference between a QU MV right now And a CQMV is the CQ includes wind shear. That's it. It's the exact same check ride from your new hire or your upgrade, and it's the exact same check ride that you're going to come back with. The only difference is they add wind shear into the CQ event. So if you spend a year preparing, you look over some manuals, you can answer basic questions on where to find things in the manuals, and you have your profiles memorized, then everything will be good to go and you won't come back for another year.
And I just anecdotally, I will say that another thing that really helped me, especially on my first CQ, was after day one of ground school, when, we knew who our sim partner was going to be. I sat down with the captain that I was going to be paired with, and we went through all of those profiles together and just really hammered out, made sure that we were both on the same page about who was doing what when, and especially, when are we getting to 1,500 feet? When are we transferring controls? When are we running the QRH? What do you want me to ask for from ATC? All of that stuff, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page so the process goes more smoothly. To your point, if you have all of that ironed out, then it makes flying the plane a lot more manageable. So if you do have the opportunity to sit down with your sim partner for any of those events, it is really, really helpful in advance.
And that is exactly right. People come here and they're like, well, I don't know what's expected of us in the sim versus the line. But the reality is if you're flying the line by the company manuals, that is what is expected of you in the sims. It's people who show up and they don't know what the green card is, right? They don't know to use the reference card to aid in their departure briefings, which we do threat forward briefings here. We do threat forward briefings on both departure and arrival. They don't know what needs to be covered on just a visual approach because the reference card just says, hey, brief the arrival runway. That's basically it. And then you brief your taxi to and from. But if you were to do the line operations, yes, the sim does have some handicaps. You cannot view real-time digital ATIS on your iPad because the sims are written as a scripted item. So you're going to have to use the ATIS that is provided. You're going to have to use the release a little bit more in the sims because, again, we cannot have the releases provide real-time data that your iPad would apply. But overall, it is still a pretty even comparison. The FMSs that we have in Charlotte, they do descend vias. You could utilize the fuel page to figure out your fuel numbers. It is very, very almost probably about a 95% solution as close as you can get it to the line. The difference is that you are being held to the standard in the sims. Whereas on the line, people tend to get a little bit complacent. And that's part of the CQ is we bring everybody back together to reset the standard. Yeah. And, it seems like we get manual updates about weekly between our 3 manuals, but manual updates still take time. So there's things that are coming out that are best practice from the training department. That doesn't mean that they are rooted in manual yet. So things like the descent via, you still are a pilot. Nothing the training department really wants to do is going to handcuff a pilot and say, you absolutely 100% have to do this way. The company, they would prefer us to be able to do that, but we operate in too much of a dynamic environment to say, hey, you are a pilot. You are given the freedom of being a pilot. The PIC is the ultimate authority for the safe operation of the aircraft. And as long as at the end of the day, the why answer gets answered in a very safe manner, that's what ALPA is here for. That's what the pilot group is here for. We're here to support each other. Not second guess what somebody else has already done, but we also need to learn from other people's mistakes. So if you have a mistake, yes, it may be embarrassing, but why hide it if we can learn from it? When we used to go into a New York airport on the Hudson, there was a company page that said, make sure you're landing at the one on the east side of the Hudson. Because there was an airport on the west side of the Hudson that had exact identical runways, right? I wonder why that ended up getting
that was rude of
an
engineer at some point. Right.
So when you're shooting your visual approach, make sure it's backed up by an instrument approach. We don't do that just for the vertical guidance. We do that to make sure that we're actually shooting the approach to the runway we were designated to go to. And the number one job of every ATP pilot is to protect your PRD. And the only person who can protect your PRD is yourself. And the only way we can do that is by being professional, safe pilots.
Absolutely. Safety is our number one priority.